Good evening. Let me begin by thanking everyone who made this event possible, including Nicolas, Cheryl, Soraya, and all the others named, the departments and the individuals. I'm really honored that such a great effort was made to bring me here. I'm going to start with a little bit of a reading of something I was reviewing today. I didn't write this, but it actually comes from an Amnesty International report. On Sunday, 20 July 2014, at around 6:45 p.m., 3 missiles struck the apartment of the Al-Hallaq family, located on the second floor of the 9-story Cordoba building in the Rimal residential neighborhood in central Gaza City. 2 of the missiles penetrated the floor into the apartment of the Ammar family on the floor below. The attack killed 7 members of the Al-Hallaq family and 4 members of the Ammar family. 3 missiles struck the Al-Hallaq family's apartment. 1 detonated in the television room, where the 3 Al-Hallaq children were watching cartoons on television, killing all of them, as well as the owner of the home, who was in his bedroom across the hall. Another hit the kitchen adjacent to the television room, killing 3 women who had been preparing iftar, the fast-breaking meal during Ramadan. 5 men who were in the sitting room, located in the northeastern corner of the apartment, survived the initial strike. Several minutes later, by which point the men had left the apartment in haste, a 3rd missile struck the sitting room. At least 2 of the missiles penetrated the floor into the Ammar family's apartment on the floor below, killing 4 of its members, all children. Muhammad Akram al-Hallaq, one of the survivors, told Amnesty International's field workers in Gaza about what happened. Here's a little piece of his testimony after he emerged from the rubble. I got out, and on my way out I saw my mother lying down in the corridor, half of her body under the rubble and the other half above. I tried to get her out, but I couldn't. One of the pillars of the house fell on her body and I realized she wasn't breathing at all, but I stayed. I wanted to stay because I didn't want to regret it afterwards. Maybe there was a chance to save her, and I didn't want to miss that chance. Then I realized that it was over. That's just one of the many harrowing testimonies from the report from Amnesty called Gaza Under the Rubble that was published after the summer 2014 attack on Gaza, 51 days. And this particular report examines one aspect of Israel's attack, which is the deliberate targeting of civilian homes. What is notable about that attack by Israel is that it wasn't an accident. It was very targeted. In that case, and in all the other cases, Amnesty examined, they could find no legitimate military target that would justify these kinds of attacks that killed, in total in Gaza, 2,200 people, 551 of them children, and destroyed more than 20,000 homes and damaged more than 100,000 others. Now, well over a year later, you still have more than 100,000 people who are homeless and who are without, where there's been no reconstruction at all. The key phrase that Amnesty uses is that Israel displayed callous indifference to the lives of Palestinian civilians during its attacks. This, Nicolas was kind enough to mention the Electronic Intifada, the publication I edit. This is today's front page, by the way. We publish daily news analysis about Palestine. I encourage you to look at it. You can also sign up for our once-a-day digest of everything we publish. But this is a piece, a photo story that we published in July, marking the first anniversary of these attacks, and profiling some of the families that are still living in the rubble, and not just living in the rubble, but living in the rubble without loved ones who were killed in the war. And these photos are by a Gaza photographer called Zanoun, and the text is by Charlotte Silver, one of our regular reporters. There was a UN Human Rights Council independent inquiry into the attack on Gaza. It wasn't, if you would believe some of the Israeli government propaganda, it was headed by notorious haters of Israel, anti-Semites, etc. It was an independent commission headed by a former Justice of the New York State Supreme Court, Justice Mary McGowan Davis. And we can sum up that this report, like so many other UN reports before it, found clear evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and called for accountability, called for perpetrators of war crimes to be brought to justice. What is particularly notable about this report is it says that the mass destruction and killing inflicted by Israel, often amounting to war crimes, quote, may have constituted military tactics reflective of a broader policy approved at least tacitly by decision makers at the highest levels of the government of Israel. In other words, this isn't a few rogue commanders on the ground. This was the policy of the state. I think it's important to know that whereas Israel is responsible for what happened, the attack on Gaza was carried out under a number of pretexts. The usual pretexts, which are for me too boring to spend a lot of time on, but I invite you to challenge me on them if you want to in the question and answer, that, you know, Gaza, a giant open-air prison for 1.8 million Palestinians, is somehow a threat to Israel. This is a territory with an unemployment rate of 50%. It has a per capita income of about 1/100th of Israel's. It is a territory without natural resources and whose productive capacity, which was quite significant, was destroyed by a siege that Israel has laid to it by land, sea, and air for now 8 years. I was in Gaza in 2013, in May 2013. It was very hard. It's now impossible, basically, for most people to get to Gaza. But I was able to get there in May 2013 as part of a group of writers who went as part of the Palestine Festival of Literature. And we were able to go through Egypt. We were able to get permission from the Egyptian authorities to make the trek across the northern Sinai and to go in through Rafah crossing. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but we made it into Gaza and spent a week there. Now, just a few weeks later, there was the military coup in Egypt, which closed off the coup regime in Egypt, which is fully supported by the United States, incidentally, closed off the Egyptian side of the border, meaning that now for well over a year, it's almost impossible for all but a tiny fraction of people to get in and out of Gaza. So it's in fact much easier to visit someone in a maximum security prison than to get into Gaza. I digress slightly, but what I want to say is that leave aside the pretexts for now. We'll come back to that if you want to. The point is this, that this level of destruction in Gaza is only possible thanks to I was in the car coming up from Denver today and listening to public radio. Unfortunately, it's the pledge drive. Public radio is important, you should support them, but it's really hell to listen to. But you know, they kept saying that this programming is made possible by you. Well, these massacres in Gaza are made possible by you and me and all of us in the United States who pay our taxes and who support Israel to the tune of $3 billion in military aid a year. But more than that, the military aid is of course crucial. And let's remember that the Obama administration actually restocked Israel's bombs and grenades in the middle of the 51-day massacre. They could have said no. You know, they could have said, we're not going to do that. The sky wouldn't have fallen down, by the way. You know, people say, and I reject this, they say, oh, the president, he has no freedom of movement on this. He has to do what the powerful lobbies tell him. No, he doesn't. He had the power to say, we're not going to send these bombs to Israel. And when he wants to defy the Israel lobby on, say, Iran, apparently he can do that. But he didn't do it on this. And because of that, many more people died. But it's not just the bombs and the weapons. That's crucial. And it's particularly crucial because you should know that right now, the Obama administration is renegotiating its military aid agreement with Israel for the next 10 years, starting in 2017 to 2027. And what's on the table now is increasing the military aid from $3 billion a year to $4.5 billion. That's a 50% increase. And there's a petition online that you can go to. Maybe we can search for it afterwards, because I think it's at the US Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation website. Already 60,000 people have signed it, telling President Obama that they do not want this increase in US military aid. So the aid is crucial, but it's also the diplomatic and political cover. I talked about the UN report. The UN report called for accountability for anyone responsible for war crimes. And by the way, in the report that includes Palestinians, although on a much, much lesser scale than Israel, to be brought to justice. Palestinians have said, fine, bring it. We're prepared to stand in court and defend our actions. But of course, the Obama administration, hello. The Obama administration has blocked every avenue for justice for the Palestinians. It's used its clout, in short, to block any action in the UN or in any other international forum. Many people warn that it's only a matter of time before, with nothing changed, no reconstruction, things getting worse in Gaza, for the ceasefire to break down. In fact, the ceasefire is really a misnomer because it's been a one-sided ceasefire, whereas Hamas has not fired a single rocket at Israel since the ceasefire. There's been a tiny handful of rockets fired, but the Israelis will tell you that they were not fired by Hamas, and Hamas has been trying to stop them. But what Israeli General General Giora Eiland wrote the other day in Yediot Ahronot is that Hamas's will to stop small splinter groups from firing rockets is degrading because you know, they're basically enforcing the ceasefire while people in Gaza see things getting worse and worse. But from the other side, the ceasefire has not been respected by Israel. There have been, in fact, up until June, more than 400 violations documented by the United Nations. And this includes small arms fire that has killed and injured Palestinians in Gaza and regular attacks on Palestinian fishermen. But Gaza is only territorially about 2% of the area of historic Palestine, what is Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And 1.8 million Palestinians. It's about a third of the Palestinian population that's within historic Palestine. I haven't even touched the rest yet. There is nowhere in historic Palestine, Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip together, where Palestinians are not under assault. Now, yes, you will have read in the newspaper in recent days that Israelis have been killed. And let's be clear, Israeli civilians, when they're killed or injured, are victims, just like Palestinians are victims. But Israel is not the victim. Israel is an occupying power, and what we have is a situation that is one of radical inequality. Occupying power, that's a word that how do we connect with that? What does it even mean? And I was thinking about a way to demonstrate what occupation means. What does it mean to be under military occupation? And I thought I would show a brief video. And I know that some people are recording audio, so I'll just describe what this is before I play a couple of minutes of it. This is a video published by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem earlier this year. B'Tselem, among others, has given Palestinians cameras, and Palestinians also, like a lot of human beings, have cameras. They don't always have to be given them by an Israeli human rights group. But this particular video is part of a documentation project run by B'Tselem, and it shows a night raid on a Palestinian home in Hebron on the 24th of February 2015. So I'll just play a couple of minutes of it and then say something about it. I think the audio is unmuted.
כל מי שבבית,
יש רק שני ילדים קטנים יושבים בבית.
מאיפה בחדר?
אבל הוא ישנים עכשיו.
פה בחדר יש מישהו?
לא, בואו לא. יש לי אחד בן 9 שנים ואחד בן 14 שנה.
זה גיל שמוצרים. יש שתי ידיים, נכנסו. עדיין. זהו. עדיין. وين ولد؟
בחדר.
من ولد؟
בחדר.
בסדר. פה, תקעו את החדר פה. פה כמו צוות. שתי ידיים, קנה, זיג.
אתה עצרי? מה אתם באים בשעה כזאת? מה אכפת לנו אנחנו?
אחי, אני רוצה כבר את העלות שלי. תראה מה, ولد? רואים את הילדים שלך? תנו כאן את החדרים שעוד לא בדקתם, שעוד לא פתחתם.
זה אחר.
קדש? בן כמה?
9 שנים.
9?
כן.
יקום.
יקום?
כן, כן, הסלام. טוב, הסלام.
אוי, בוא.
סלام.
תגיד שם, עכשיו, הילד מפחד עכשיו. תגידי שלגנתי. תגידי שלגנתי. חלוס אותי. או, מעבור. או, אני יכול לשאול את זה. די מעי.
אתה די בטוח שהגיע לסלון? כמה הילד השני?
14 שנים.
כמה?
14.
14? כן. שהגיע גם.
אבל הוא לא רואה, יש לו בעיה בעיניים.
בסדר, תעזרו לו שישב פה.
בסדר, בוא עזרו לו. עוד עזרו לו. איפה שבוע?
שישב על הסטטון. כמה אתה? כזה שומבק? כזה שומבק? סליחה? אתה זורק פה לפני אבנים? לא? אף פעם? בטוח?
חושב שהוא מבין, יענו?
כן.
חושב שהוא מבין?
כן, אני חושב.
מה זה? לא נכון, זה לא נכון. זה בטח לא זורק.
סלמה אחרת.
אבל לא ככה, למה אתם לא באים ב-10 בבוקר, לא ב-2, 3
All right, I'm just going to stop it there. But that's a nightly occurrence. This is not a rare thing. This is regular. And in fact, another story we have on the Electronic Intifada talks about the systematic mapping of the Palestinian population by Israel. That these night raids, what they do, they go in, they wake up the kids, they photograph the kids, and they are developing a total database of the Palestinian population, focusing on the children. Now, as you saw, those soldiers are carrying guns. Those guns have real bullets in them, and people do get shot. The soldiers were relatively well behaved here because they knew there was a camera. But even so, it's pretty frightening to think that you have absolutely no place if you're Palestinian that is immune to the Israeli army. Not your bedroom, not your kitchen, not your bathroom. The other aspect of occupation is that there is no law that protects you. If you are killed, and Palestinians are killed all the time, there won't be an investigation. There won't be anyone brought, there won't be forensic teams that come and say, you know, who shot you, where did the bullet go? It's not like on TV. Nothing happens. You're dead. That's it. Your son is dead. Your mother is dead. No one will investigate. No one will bring anyone to justice. A perfect example of that is what happened to the Dawabsheh family in August, when Israeli settlers, they were seen, there were plenty of eyewitnesses, Israel doesn't deny that it was Israeli settlers, burnt the house of the Dawabsheh family, killing 18-month-old baby Ali Dawabsheh and mortally injuring his mother Riham and his father Saad. The only survivor is the 4-year-old brother Ahmed, who is horrifically burned. A few weeks ago, Israel's defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, revealed that Israel knows who did it, but they've decided not to arrest them. That's occupation. No protection for your life. You can be killed with impunity. And the number of cases are very many. On the other hand, occupation means that whereas your life as a Palestinian is worthless, the lives of Israeli settlers are priceless. So examples of that, just the other day, Israel demolished the homes of 3 Palestinians who are alleged to have attacked settlers. In one case, killed Israelis. In one case, it's clear that the Palestinian did do it. In the other cases, who knows? Because there's no system of due process. The Israeli army says you did something, you did something. In one case, the family home of Mu'taz Hijazi, they accused him. We actually have a picture in one of our stories of oops. See, I have to remember where all the things are. Here we go. This is a picture of the father of Ghassan Abu Jaber, who killed 4 Israelis. This was more than a year ago. He's dead. He was killed. But just the other day, the Israelis came and destroyed the family home. That's called collective punishment. It's illegal under international law. International law is very clear that you cannot punish someone for something they did not personally do. So now you have a whole family who is homeless, whose home is destroyed because of something a family member did or was accused of doing. This law is not applied to Jews. So, for example, the man who stabbed and killed several people, the Jewish man who stabbed and killed several people at the Jerusalem Gay Pride Parade a couple of months ago, his family home will not be demolished. Even if they arrest the settlers who killed the Dawabshe family, their families will not be punished. That will never happen. So that's what occupation means. It means a system in which if you're the wrong type of person, your life is utterly worthless and without protection. And if you're a member of the privileged group, your life is priceless. And the wrath of the state, the wrath of the army, will be brought down on anyone who is deemed to threaten it. That's what occupation means. And that's what Palestinians are struggling against for their freedom. I'll say now that this system of what many call apartheid, or I would call apartheid, what Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Prize-winning South African freedom fighters, called apartheid, is a system that extends throughout Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, but it operates in different degrees and different ways. Gaza is, let's say, the sharpest end of the Israeli regime, the most brutal, the most violent. Then you have the occupation in the West Bank, which features many elements of what's in Gaza, but in some ways the violence is not less, but it's less visible. It's constant. If you're a Palestinian, your life is ruled by Israeli guns, but it's less visible to the outside world, and less there are the occasional outbursts where Israelis get killed or injured, then all of a sudden it's a headline on CNN. But let's not forget Israel itself, because often the argument you'll get from people is they'll say, yes, well, there are problems in Gaza and the West Bank, but there's a conflict there, and we earnestly want to solve them. It's true we've been negotiating for 20 years, but let's just keep negotiating. Let's keep building settlements at the same time. But, you know, we admit there's a problem there. It's not perfect. But look at Israel itself. Israel is a democracy. President Obama never tires of praising Israel's vibrant democracy. And what I would argue is that, in fact, there is no democracy in any part of it, because Israel is a system, a regime that is built on the dispossession and displacement of Palestinians and the subjugation of those who are left. And that includes Palestinian citizens of Israel. I've talked about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but there's another 1.5 million Palestinians who have Israeli passports, and the Israeli government always likes to boast about how they get to vote and how there are 12 Arab members of parliament in the Israeli Knesset. Although you may remember that just before the last election, Netanyahu actually issued an urgent warning to Israeli voters just before the election. I have that video if anyone wants to really see it again. where he appealed in this very sectarian and chauvinist way to Jewish voters, go out and vote. The Arabs are going to the polls in droves. And you can just imagine, if you translate the racial and sectarian overtones into American terms, what that would sound like to our ears. Some people in our country would love it. No shortage of racists here, let's not kill ourselves. But those of us who believe everyone should have equal rights, I think would be horrified. But there are also 50 laws, about 50 laws in Israel, that discriminate against people based on their religion and ethnicity. Israel is the only state in the world that is not a state of its citizens. What does that mean? It means Israel doesn't claim to be a state of Israeli citizens. It claims to be a state of Jews. What that means is that a Jewish person living in the United States or in Canada or in Venezuela who has never set foot in Israel, who has no family there, has more rights under Israeli law than a Palestinian citizen of Israel. I'm not talking about now even Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. A Palestinian citizen of Israel. This involves everything from access to land, housing, all sorts of government benefits, the job market, it goes on. So, in fact, there are a number of Israeli Jews who went to the court in Israel, who went to the Supreme Court, who said, we do not want there's no such thing, this might sound strange, but Israel doesn't recognize Israeli nationality. In the population registry in Israel, it recognizes only Jewish nationality, and it'll put you down as Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, or it has these various ethno-racial religious categories. So they went to court and they said, we don't want to be registered as Jews. We want to be registered as Israeli. And in December it was in the last 2 years, I don't remember the date now, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled against that. They said, if we have Israeli nationality, it undermines the Jewishness of the state, because it would mean that everyone would have equal rights effectively, and we can't have that. I wrote an article, I'm going to end with this. I wrote an article during the last massacre in Gaza called "The Gaza Massacre is the Price of a Jewish State." And I believed that it was important to put things in very stark terms, and I quoted a senior advisor to the Israeli government. His name is Arnon Sofer, and he was one of the key minds behind the so-called Gaza disengagement, which basically cut Gaza off from the world. And he explained why they did it, why they turned Gaza into this closed ghetto. He said that they called it unilateral separation. It doesn't guarantee peace. It guarantees a Jewish Zionist state with an overwhelming Jewish majority of Jews. What will be the price of this? This was written, by the way, in 2005, 10 years ago. The text I'm quoting was written 10 years ago by Arnon Sofer. And he says, the day after unilateral separation, the Palestinians will bombard us with artillery fire, and we will have to retaliate. But at least the war will be at the fence, not in the kindergartens of Tel Aviv and Haifa. We will tell the Palestinians that if a single missile is fired over the fence, we will fire 10 in response, and women and children will be killed, and houses will be destroyed. Further down the line, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will be even bigger animals than they are today, with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war, So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. And he adds, if we don't kill, we will cease to exist. The only thing that concerns me is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings. Shocking words, but I believe that is the logic that underlies what we saw in Gaza last year, what we're seeing in the West Bank today, and what we see throughout Palestine. Palestinians want to end this, and a good many decent Israelis want to end it too. And what Palestinians have called for, they've looked at the decades of UN resolutions that have gone unfulfilled, more reports, more resolutions passed by the Human Rights Council, blocked and ignored. And this was the rationale behind the 2005 Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They said, look, we, with almost no power, cannot stand up to Israel with this much power and this much support from the United States. So we need the help of people of conscience all around the world. And they modeled this call, you could just find it very easily by searching for Palestinian Bds Call. And it's modeled on the campaign that we had against apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 80s, and it says, boycott Israel, divest from Israel, apply sanctions to Israel until it respects the rights of all Palestinians. Very simple, very clear. I won't go into detail now because I want to move to the discussion, but of course the Israeli response to this has been to cry anti-Semitism. That somehow opposing Israeli war crimes, Israeli theft of land from Palestinians, Israeli human rights abuses is somehow anti-Jewish. Let's be very clear about this, that for me, the Palestinian rights movement is an anti-racist movement. It must be, it has to be, or it's not worth fighting for. And this includes vigorous opposition to all forms of discrimination, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And there are plenty of Jewish people who support this movement and who are part of it. Efforts to divide us by saying this is an anti-Jewish movement are just that, efforts to divide us. But the other point that's important to make is it's crucial to make a distinction. Just because Israel says it represents all Jews, I mean, ISIS may claim to represent all Muslims, but we don't respond to that by saying, therefore, all Muslims support ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Saudi Arabia or whatever else. So we mustn't fall into the trap of collectively blaming Jews for what Israel does. We have to be very clear what the target is and what the goal is. It says it on the tin right here, the BDS movement for freedom, justice, and equality. Those terms include everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. So we're going to have some time for our question now.
And we do have a microphone here.
Can you switch
coming around?
Yes, we can.
We want
That's on the line.
We can. Mute video. You want more mic or it's okay?
No, it's perfect. So, any question?
Sure.
Okay.
Hey, given what you've...
Microphone, no?
Where is the microphone?
Anyone who'd like to make formulate a question, line up here.
But I think the goal of the microphone is that they're recording this for alternative radio. So they want you to speak in the microphone. They can edit all this bit out where we're talking about the microphone. So we just have to find. So which microphone do people use?
Right here.
That one? Okay,
Yeah.
so people can form a line. Okay, I get it now. I'm too slow. All right.
Given what you said about one UN resolution and report coming out over the decades with little to no result, how much faith do Palestinians on the ground have in incrementally entering the United Nations as a full nation?
That's a great question. I personally have no faith in that. I can't speak for all Palestinians. But, you know, in recent years, there's been this sort of push by the Palestinian Authority to have Palestine recognized at the UN and to have it, you know, have the flag up. They had a big to-do the other day with the flag raising. I personally find that stuff at best very irritating because it doesn't get at any of the fundamentals. It's not just feel-good stuff. I think it's giving these states that are so complicit an easy out. I'll give an example. You know, one of the most anti-Palestinian governments in the world is the French government, in terms of it, not only its support for Israel, but its repression of free speech in France. I mean, this is the irony. France is, you know, je suis Charlie, but not when it comes to Palestine. You know, universities in France ban talks on Palestine routinely. It's happened to great scholars like Ilan Pape. It happened the other day to the author Ben White at the university in Toulouse, where his talk was summarily banned by the president. We see in France numerous BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions activists, routinely put on trial for protests. You don't hear about this, though you can read about it on the Electronic Intifada. I think we're probably the only publication in English that is consistently reporting on the repression in France when it comes to Palestine. And all of this this is not just individual prosecutors. This is a directive from the French government, from the justice minister to local prosecutors saying, go after this. And that's within France, and then on the international level, France is, you know, one of the most pro-Israel governments. And the French foreign minister was there clapping for the Palestinian flag when it went up. So that, you know, that tells you something. So that was a long answer, but very little is the short answer. All right.
I was just wondering what your opinion of Hamas is.
Well, Hamas is a broad-based Palestinian national movement that is supported by a large number of people and seen by a large number of Palestinians as a legitimate political party and a legitimate resistance movement. Even if people do not support all of their tactics, Hamas is known in the US as most notorious for the attacks it carried out in the 1990s and early 2000s, which killed many Israeli civilians, including bus bombings and bombings of cafes and so on. By the way, it wasn't just Hamas that did that. It was also President Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah faction that did that, though that doesn't stop Israel from dealing with him. That's an interesting point that is worth thinking about. Hamas moved away from those tactics towards more military tactics in recent years. That's discussed in great detail in the UN Human Rights Council report. And that UN Human Rights Council report points out that in the Gaza conflict, Hamas said that it was targeting the Israeli military. The report says the weapons they use, you know, most of their lethal attacks were against the military. All of the attacks that they carried out through tunnels from Gaza were, this is again in the UN Human Rights Council report, were against legitimate military targets. This is interesting because the New York Times, when it reported on the tunnels, it talked about terror tunnels, which Israelis feared were going to be used to attack kindergartens and schools and this sort of thing. And the UN report said that they were only used to attack legitimate military targets. The UN report also says regardless of what Hamas says, its missiles are unguided. They don't have guidance systems, and so those indiscriminate attacks would violate the laws of war. But within that framework, I've been saying for many years, and I'm not the only one saying this, that there is ultimately no political solution that doesn't involve Hamas, because it is a broad movement with broad legitimacy among Palestinians. This is a realization that I think some in the international community have come to recently. For example, it has been reported that Tony Blair, not my favorite character, but certainly a person with a lot of clout, has been mediating talks between Hamas and Israel over a long-term truce for Gaza. So far, nothing has come of that, but there are hints that it may still be going on. The article I mentioned from General Giora Island the other day says that it's still in Israel's long-term interest to have a deal with Hamas. So I think that, the reality is that Hamas is there. It's a political movement. It's been labeled terrorist, but I don't think by any objective criteria it can be said to be more terrorist than Israel. And so if you deal with Israel, then you have to also deal with Hamas. So that's my view.
Thank you for your work and dedication. I just wanted to say that my name is Carolyn Beninsky. I'm with the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, and we've been working on BDS and also to try and pressure Congress to cut funding, U.S. funding for the Israeli occupation. And I would like to invite anyone who has time to come and get involved with us on that. And the flyer I handed out on the TPP has our contact information. What I wanted to ask you, Ali, is could you talk a little bit more about your ideas about a one-state solution for Israel-Palestine?
Thank you. I knew we were going to get that question. I was hoping anyway. I argue in my book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, that the system I described, think about Israel as a system of control of millions of, it's a system of privilege for Israelis and a system of control and oppression for Palestinians. I think this system has to be transformed. In my book, I criticize the notion of territorial and ethnic partition. I argue that it is a cause of violence and not a solution to violence. Territorial partition for ethnic purposes anywhere in the world has always been a violent process. That's been true in India, it's been true in Ireland, it's certainly been true in Palestine, and in Palestine I think that a further territorial partition cannot produce a stable political solution. And so I argue that the current system is basically a one-state solution, but it's a single state that is entirely controlled by one ethnic group for its own benefit. It is an ethnocracy, an Israeli Jewish ethnocracy that violently rules over an equal number of Palestinians. That's important to know, that there are about 5.5, 6 million Israeli Jews and an equal number of Palestinians within historic Palestine. So half the population rules over the other half. And this is untenable. I haven't talked about the Palestinian refugees outside the country who are in fact an equal number at least to the Palestinians inside the country. So I argue that transformation is by far the most moral and ethical goal, transformation of this one-state apartheid system into a democratic single state, which could take a number of forms. I don't get caught up on the particular details, but the basic principle is of a single territorial and geopolitical entity with equal rights for all its citizens, restitution for those who have been unjustly treated, and a deep process of decolonization. In my book, I talk about parallels with South Africa and Northern Ireland, and I argue that there are strong parallels and positive lessons as well as warnings. I'm not arguing in the book that either South Africa or Ireland have become utopias, but they have found that they found ways to transform seemingly intractable situations created by settler colonialism into legitimate political settlements. And despite everything, I think that is still possible in Palestine, Israel. And I think that, in a sense, the Israeli regime, but I use the word regime not in the way the media uses it, but in the sense of this Israeli system of control and colonialism is reaching its end and is facing a crisis of legitimacy. As we've often seen in parallel cases, as these things happen, they tend to become more extreme, more violent, more racist, close their eyes and ears to what's happening, develop a mentality in which they alone are the victims. Israel is convinced it is the victim and no one else, that the world is against it. This paranoia was really very much on display. If any of you heard the speech of Benjamin Netanyahu to the UN a few days ago, I mean, it was just a very bizarre speech, but it really captured this kind of paranoia. I think that this growing paranoia in Israel, this growing extremism, is one of the features of a regime reaching its end. And I think what it needs to bring about the conditions for the kind of transformation I'm talking about is for the balance to be shifted, the balance of power. And that's why I think BDS is such a crucial element in moving forward to a just and peaceful future.
So thank you for your excellent talk. My name is Theo Haresh. I do a lot of online pro-Palestinian work. And one of the things I've noticed about the pro-Palestinian movement as opposed to other global political movements or national political movements, like say the climate movement or the movement to end inequality in the United States, is that we tend to get very, very into these specific abuses. We track it with videos. Many of us have been to the West Bank and tracked these things. We have these very detailed reports. The Electronic Intifada is, I'd say, from what I can see, is at the forefront of that process. It's an extremely effective process, but oftentimes I've noticed that there's a lack of ability to articulate the big picture, to discuss strategy. There's not a lot of editorializing on what's happening with the occupation. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the sort of trade-offs between focusing on these very specific instances of injustices and trying to foster a broader dialogue and spend more time talking about solutions, strategy, etc.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I agree. Excellent question. Well, you know, you're right to some extent. The reason we focus on what's happening is because the experience of being Palestinian is the experience of being disbelieved. And having to constantly prove your existence. You know, there's now this trend in American politics of calling the Palestinians an invented people. So you have no history, you have no legitimacy. Anything you say about what Israel does is called a lie or a blood libel. So there is this tremendous focus on documenting and reporting. In fact, this is probably the most documented conflict anywhere in the world. There's no doubt about what's happening. No fair-minded person can go into this and say, I want to find out what's happening, and come away without seeing the reality. And the reality is, you know, is not two-sided. Reality is not, oh, you know, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Reality is brutal inequality. Reality is the brutal use of force by one group of people against another. And that's what you find. But that's not reflected. Even today, with all this documentation, it's not reflected in mainstream coverage. They still talk about Israel as the victim. If we're lucky, they talk about both sides as somehow equal. So that's that. But where I don't agree with you is that there is a great deal of discussion and strategizing and thinking. I would say we haven't found all the answers, but I would say it's there. And I think one of the BDS movement has really shifted the discussion, because it brought it back to fundamental Palestinian rights. The end the occupation, equal rights for all Palestinians in Israel, and rights for refugees, including the right of return. Nobody wanted to talk about that. The only thing that was acceptable to talk about in this country, in nice liberal circles, was ending the occupation. And what the BDS Call says is, no, it's bigger than the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. It's a whole system. And that shift, I think, is really visible, even on the editorial pages of the New York Times, where they still exclude Palestinians. I mean, very rarely find a Palestinian voice. But where it's happening, it's incredible. It's happening on campuses all across this country. And that, I think, is really the cutting edge, or the vanguard, where you also see the backlash. I talked about France. France not having a First Amendment like we do, the repression can be very heavy-handed by the government. In this country, it's done through different means. It's done through university administrations passing speech codes. This is what's happening now in California with the University of California system. We're under pressure from pro-Israel groups. They're trying to pass a speech code which basically defines advocacy for Palestinian rights as hate speech. And there was just last week a report, two reports, one published by Palestine Legal, which is a legal defense group, and the other by Jewish Voice for Peace, documenting this kind of this free speech emergency in this country when it comes to Palestine. So also don't underestimate the extent to which people are afraid to talk about this. And you find that fear all the time. People say, oh, I'm going to stay away from this. You've seen college professors targeted, students targeted. I believe Stephen Salaita was here recently. When was he here? Last year, Stephen Salaita. Now, in a sense, he's kind of the most prominent case, but really only the tip of the iceberg. He was actually fired from a tenured position because of tweets he'd made criticizing Israel, and it's become a major sort of, his case has become a major kind of touchstone for free speech and academic freedom. But there are many others. So that also, when part of the tactic is to make us spend so much time fighting simply for the right to talk about this that we barely have time to have the discussion. So I really hear what you're saying, but I think it is happening, and we need to. What I take from you is encouragement and a challenge to do more, and I think that that's right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for mentioning free speech, repression in America, and Jewish Voice for Peace, because I stand here to represent Alison Weir and repression of her free speech within the BDS movement.
Nobody has repressed her free speech.
Very much so. I'd like you to comment on it. You have nothing to say.
Well, I'd be happy to say something about Alison Weir. Unfortunately, Alison Weir is somebody who freely and willfully and repeatedly associates with and goes on their radio shows, this is all quite well documented, of white supremacists and Nazis.
By association.
Well, she's free to associate. Nobody has questioned her right to associate with Nazis and white supremacists. She has that right. The First Amendment protects that right. but it also protects the right of people who say, we're not interested in having a white supremacy in our movement, not to associate.
Are you calling her white supremacist?
Well, you asked me a question, I'm giving you an answer. So there were statements made about this by the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which dissociated from her, which cancelled the membership of her group. And there was also a statement from JVP. And they laid out the reasons why, and they laid out the things which they disagreed with and which they approached her about. And that's their right. You can't force people to associate with people they don't want to. But no government repressed her speech. No authority repressed her speech. In fact, I've heard more from her in recent months than I have from practically anyone else.
The fact that she was on those programs and didn't object to what was being said, does that by association make her an anti-Semite?
Look, I didn't say she's an anti-Semite, but if I go on a Nazi show repeatedly and listen to Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda and white supremacist propaganda, and you hear me listening in silence, then you would be right to tell me that I should speak up. And if I did it once naively, you would say, okay, he didn't know what he was getting into. But let's not pretend that, you know, people can do this repeatedly and just say, oh, well, I talk to anyone. Well, that's fine. You can talk to anyone, but nobody is required to, to sit down with you. There are lots of people in this country who want nothing to do with me. Lots of people. I don't call that, that's their right. What they don't have the right to do is to go to the University to see you and say, you should prevent him from speaking, or for a government to prevent me from speaking. But nobody can force them to come here to this event. Nobody can force them to be involved with me. I think it's a mistake to try to accuse people who are trying to take principled positions about racism and anti-Semitism and white supremacy, to accuse them of censorship. We're not obligated to have Nazism and white supremacy in our Palestine solidarity movement. We don't want to.
All right. A higher power must have placed me right here, because I am going to cut off their discussion because they're not in line to discuss with you anymore. But this okay, two things real quick. Today is Desmond Tutu's birthday. It's great that you mentioned him.
I know that. Happy birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday, Mr. Tutu.
Yeah.
Also, I did want to say thank you to CU Boulder for sponsoring this, because of the repression on American campuses about speaking up for Palestinian rights, and you're seeing the free session here. What I wanted to ask you about was your take, I guess, or what you could tell us about what you think is happening with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's bothering me quite a lot.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a good question. Maybe I'll put it, okay if I put the screen on again. Because there's always more than I can say, but let's see. There is, sorry. There are a number of groups in Israel that, what you've seen in recent weeks and months and years is Israeli Jews going up to what they call the Temple Mount, what Palestinians call the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. This is the plateau in Jerusalem. It's in occupied East Jerusalem, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits. And certain Jews believe that they must work to bring down the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to build a third temple, a third Jewish temple in its place, which would be a very dangerous thing to do. They say that, oh, we're just going up because we want access, it's a matter of religious freedom. Well, the groups that are leading this, one of them is a group called the Temple Institute. It is a group funded by the Israeli government. And it's very clear, it's published plans to replace the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Dome of the Rock with a Jewish temple, detailed plans down to the underground parking. The head of this is a gentleman called Rabbi Israel Ariel, who, this story we did on him just a few days ago by David Sheen, an excellent reporter. And it really goes into how extreme these groups are, to the point where they proselytize for, in this report, in this speech he gives, which we have recorded and people can see it, he says that if you see President Obama in the street, you should kill him. He says that in this speech, and that's the least of it. He also praises the settlers who burned to death the Dawabsheh family that I talked about. This is the head of the Temple Institute. I did a story on this a year ago. This is Yehuda Glick. He is an American settler who is one of the leaders of this temple movement. In this photo, he's actually showing off, he's standing at the Dome of the Rock showing what it will look like when they rebuild the third temple. And Yehuda Glick was shot last October. He survived. He was shot in Jerusalem. And the Israelis accused, they didn't present any evidence of this, but a Palestinian worker in the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, where he had been taking part in a speech, and they extrajudicially executed him that night. So remember, they can't find the killers of the Dawabsheh family, but they claim to have found and killed the man who shot Yehuda Glick within a couple of hours. The reason I mention that is because one of the houses that they demolished 2 days ago was the home of Mu'taz Hijazi, the person they killed and claimed shot Yehuda Glick. So again, another example of what occupation justice looks like. But in this report, I refer to a very important and detailed report by an Israeli organization called Ir Amim, which may load, but what it is, it's a 70-page report which details the links between the temple movement and the Israeli government. They're very detailed links. And the fear is that these gradual incursions by Israelis going up there is designed to provoke enough violence and strife that as a first step, it gives Israel the excuse to partition the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to say this part is for Jews and this part is for Palestinians. And the model for that, or the precedent that Palestinians fear, is what happened in Hebron. In 1994, this was before there had ever been a Palestinian suicide bombing targeting civilians, an American settler called Baruch Goldstein from Brooklyn went into the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron during Ramadan and machine gunned 29 Palestinians who were praying. It was 40 days after that that the first ever suicide bomb targeting Israelis went off, I think in Afula or Hadera in the north. As a result of that, the Israelis said, oh, look how volatile this is, we're going to partition the mosque. And they took half of it and gave it to the Israeli settlers. So that's the fear. And I would say that this particular place, of course, has all this symbolic and religious resonance, so it's of concern not just to Palestinians. This is the report just for reference. Not just for Palestinians, but also for Muslims all over the world. And I would say that, for me, the recent historical precedent that stands in my mind is the Babri Masjid in India, in Ionia, which in 1992, this was a 400-year-old mosque. It was demolished by Hindu nationalists who believed that it was built atop the birthplace of the god Lord Ram. And this had been a cause of communal and religious disagreement for a long time, but the destruction of the Babri Masjid pushed it into large-scale violence. Thousands of people were killed, and to this day it poisons the politics of India. And I think that if the Israeli extremists backed by the government go ahead with their plans or their desires or their aspirations to partition the mosque, or heaven forbid, to destroy it, then it would be Babri Masjid times 1,000. So that's my fear of what's happening. I don't think the destruction of the mosque is imminent. I'm not saying that but I see this as part of a gradual salami slicing process. And what is interesting is that the temple movement has gone from the extremes, even within Israel, to the center, where it is openly supported by a number of government ministers. And so that's really the danger that I see. Yes. I don't know how much time we have, Nicolas, so maybe we could take 3 at a time or something like that to give more people a chance to speak, and I'll get a pen and write down your questions. Go ahead.
All right, so I just really want to thank you for what you're doing. My name is Logan Halabi-Brasova, and my question is, in any solution, whether that be statehood or a one-state solution or anything that you can think of, how do you propose to bring two governments of Gaza and West Bank, which for all intents and purposes are completely different, together to work together?
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So
I think what we could do, let's take everyone who's in line, and then probably that will be it, right? Okay. So if you're already in line, go.
Okay, cool. So I'm very committed to peace for all sides. So I'm just wondering what your plan for peace is with the one-state solution, and how we can ensure the safety of both ethnicities with your proposed solution.
Thank you.
I'm Giorgio Zenda with CU Independent, and my question is, what do you think of the right of Israel to exist as a state?
So I guess these all kind of go together, but when the PA refuses to condemn recent attacks on Jewish Israeli civilians, and they say that it was actually humane that the attacker left the children behind of the Hankin family and just watched their parents die, when Hamas openly calls for the death of Jews in their charter, when you've just excused tunnels built in Gaza to kill Israelis because it's okay since they were targeted to military pinpoints.
Do you think Palestinians have a right to attack the Israeli army?
No, I don't think anybody has.
So that's clear.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's where we differ. I can answer that one quickly, because I believe Palestinians have a right to resist an occupation. You don't.
But you're committed to nonviolence, so why is that the right? And you also said that Hamas, you've also said that... Sorry.
Take your time.
But you are committed to nonviolence, I would assume. And then you've said that Hamas is not the one launching rockets, but there have been documented 11,000 rockets launched into Israel from Gaza that target Israeli civilians, Jewish and non-Jewish. So what happens in a one-state solution when the BDS movement, and from what I can tell in all intents and purposes, you're not really calling for one state, you're calling for a Jewish free state?
I never called for that, and you can read my book, which calls for equal rights for everyone, including, of course, Jews. So that's simply a false
But we're
statement.
being targeted as well.
Yeah, but look, you know, you want to come and make arguments, that's fine, but don't misrepresent things. I never called for a Jew-free state. That's a defamatory statement. I've never ever called for that.
But you refuse to acknowledge, it seems, the collective violence against Israeli citizens.
How did I refuse to acknowledge it when I talked about it?
Wait,
but look, we'll come back to this. because I want to make sure, the reason we're going to get to you, sir, but I don't want anyone to go away from here thinking that, you know, opposite viewpoints weren't aired or didn't have a chance to be discussed. So I'm even going to give you time to come back if you need to. So we'll just hold that, we'll come back. Yes, go ahead.
A consideration more than a question. You parallel the situation in Palestine to that one of Ireland or South Africa. But here is even worse, because Ireland and South Africa didn't have new settlers, new people, continuously excavating, continuously grabbing land, territory. Even when the Israeli simulate to sit at the table, under the table the new settlers are still going like vultures. This is the reality.
Thank you. A lot of excellent questions, and some of them very related. You know, in the time I have, I can't go into great detail, but I want you to engage in these issues, and the book talks specifically about these questions of how you get safety for two peoples, and in fact more than two peoples, because I think that when we think of a binary, we eliminate so much of the diversity that exists among Israeli Jews and among also Palestinians. So I think of moving beyond these narrow binary identities as a way for people to be able to live fully and to have self-determination. But I talk about, in my book, how in South Africa, and to a lesser extent in Ireland, but it was certainly there as well, the settler narrative and the settler discourse, by settler I mean the settler state and the settler group. In this sense, Israeli Jews are a settler colonial community, as Unionists are in Northern Ireland, or were in Northern Ireland, and whites were in South Africa. Their discourse is always one of apocalypse, that we must have the status quo, or only change it on our own terms, or it's the apocalypse. We will be slaughtered in our beds, we will be thrown into the sea, look at how savage these people are, they kill us, they shoot at us, etc. That discourse is always there, and it's one that aims at generating terror or dread in the privileged group, and to make them fear change even more. By any objective measure, the violence is incredibly one-sided. Incredibly one-sided. You mentioned, for example, you said 11,000 rockets have been fired by Palestinians from Gaza. Let me ask you a couple of questions. First of all, when does that, in what period is that 11,000 fired?
I said since 2005. Since
2005. Okay. How many people have been killed by those rockets?
Is that really a measure?
I'm asking you. I'm asking you. It is one measure, yes.
No, but you're saying you're talking about privileged blood and privilege, and so the idea.
I'm asking you if you know.
Answer
the
question.
Know? No, please don't. I'm in charge. I'm asking you if you know.
I don't have the exact number.
Okay. So, but is it fewer than 50?
But I don't understand why.
I'm asking. Well, let's get the facts on the table, and then we'll do the analysis. Start with the facts.
Okay.
Okay. Do you know?
I just said I don't know.
Okay, it's about 24. Okay. Now, let me ask you. You seem to know how many rockets Palestinians have fired. How many rockets and bombs has Israel fired into Gaza since 2005?
More than that.
How much more? Lots.
And I never said, for the record, I never said that that was right.
Okay, but for some reason you thought it was only relevant to mention rockets fired by Palestinians. All right, now, do you know how many Palestinians have been killed by Israeli ordnance since 2005 just in Gaza?
Several thousand.
Okay, several thousand. Do you know how many Israelis die each year in traffic accidents?
No.
It's about 500. Okay, so what you're saying is that, now, do you believe that if Israel had not dropped, and I did a calculation that, and this was, corroborated by others who've done the same thing, that just in the last attack on Gaza last summer, that Israel dropped the equivalent of the Hiroshima bomb on Gaza. Do you think if Israel, that doesn't include all the other attacks going back to 2005 and before, do you believe that if Palestinians were not being subjected to this, that they would just out of sheer bloody-mindedness fire rockets at Israel? Be honest. Be honest. Do you think that what Israel has done has anything at all to do with the fact that Palestinians fire rockets from Gaza?
Given that the blockade didn't happen until 2007, and that it was the blockade was started because of violence coming out of Gaza, and I am not saying that Israel is free from all blame. I do not believe that. What I am saying is that calling for a one-state solution when Hamas's charter clearly says, oh, Muslim, call for the death of the Jews. Hold on.
Hold on. What does the Likud charter say? And doesn't it claim Eretz Israel as all Jewish land?
It calls for a Jewish state.
In what territory?
In historic Israel.
Which is how far? Where are its borders? Okay. So you want to look at charters. Now what have the leaders...
It doesn't call for the death of Palestinians.
Well, I mean, if you want me to find you Israeli leaders calling for the death of Palestinians.
And you can do the same for Arab MPs.
Yeah, but yes, but then, okay, you can do the same, right? You're saying you can do the same. But there's a difference, for example, Ayelet Shaked and her infamous call for genocide. And I can find you many other. There's a difference, though. There's a difference that you're not recognizing here. The massive difference in power. The massive difference in power. And that's a fundamental fact. So what I would submit to you is that Palestinians, like black South Africans, like Catholics in Ireland, are not a monstrous people hell-bent on bloodshed and savagery who, will slaughter people in their beds the minute they're let out of their cages. And that's what much, I'm not saying that's what you think, but that's what much Israeli propaganda seems to say, that they are a people living in an impossible situation in which they are, their experience of Israeli violence is pervasive, total, and relentless, to the extent that there are nightly raids, night raids on dozens of Palestinian homes. This is systematic. There are not Palestinian soldiers raiding the bedrooms of children in Tel Aviv nightly.
No,
that doesn't happen.
Get on buses. And now I'm not saying all Palestinians.
Okay. When was the last bus bombing? When was the last? Sorry?
Are you kidding me? The Hankaville was just slaughtered in front of their children.
Yes, and I talked about that Israelis can be victims, and attacks on civilians are atrocious. They're very rare. It's rare that Israelis are killed. It's atrocious that people are killed. You cannot claim that the violence that you're seeing has nothing to do with the conditions Palestinians live under. I know how this is. I know how the Israeli propaganda organizations who are going to watch this video or listen to this are going to say, he's standing there justifying attacks on civilians. I'm not justifying attacks on civilians. I'm telling you a political reality that when you impose these sorts of conditions on millions of people, some are going to respond with violence. And if you believe that building higher walls, building more fences, killing more Palestinians, dropping more one-ton bombs on apartment buildings, more mowing the lawn, as they call it in Gaza, is going to one day make Israelis safe from any form of violence, then it's delusional. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that the road to ending violence, the road to ending violence, all violence, the violence that first and foremost victimizes Palestinians, and the violence that victimizes Israelis, is to end the injustice, end the apartheid, stop dehumanizing Palestinians as savage, barbaric people who just want to slaughter Jews. Actually listen to what Palestinians are saying. You can even listen to what Hamas is saying. It's in my book. On the eve of their elections and after the elections they won in 2006, Khalid Mishal gave an interview to the New York Times, which is repeated ad nauseum. He's said this many times. It's the position of Hamas. We accept the 1967 borders. We are offering Israel a long-term truce. We do not see a final political settlement now, but we do believe a long-term truce could create the conditions for something in the future. That's actually Hamas's position, not the charter from 1988. The charter from 1988 is not their policy right now. But actually the Likud charter is the Israeli government's policy. Their policy is to settle all the land. It is to grab the hilltops. It is to take the Jordan Valley. It is to support, to fund these groups that want to destroy the temple. So the other thing you can't do is stand here and give the impression that, poor little Israel just wants peace, but those mean Palestinians keep firing rockets at it. That narrative does not survive the facts. I think I will just say that we'll end there. Just one other thing, because I want you to go to the Electronic Intifada, use it, and to remind you, I have these fabulous laptop stickers, bumper stickers, whatever you want. I'm just going to leave here, come grab one. Don't stick them anywhere you're not allowed to stick them. And I think Nicola has an announcement.
Yes. So, just to let you know that we are selling books at this table right here. And Ali is going to sign the book. Also, we have a list. We want to try to start creating a Palestine Solidarity Group on campus. So if you are interested, you can sign, put your name on the list. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to try to slide.